Vince Neil has really let himself go. Yeah.
Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercising my first amendment rights vlog style, and it's time for another episode of What's Wrong With.
What's wrong with me? You wanna know what's wrong with me? I can ask you the exact same thing. What's wrong with me?
This is a What's Wrong With I actually wasn't originally planning on making back when I started this series. While glam metal, or as it's more derogatorily called, hair metal, was always one of the primary targets of metal elitist ire, it was also a genre that got perhaps the most mixed reactions from that side of the metal community. For as much as there were bands that got singled out pretty consistently when bashing the genre, such as Poison, Warrant, Enough's Enough, Trickster, and maybe even there was a surprising number of bands from the glam scene that these people would make an exception for, to the point where I made a video back in the day that was essentially just made to say, consistency! For as much as these people liked scoffing at glam for how over-the-top their image and stage presence was, and how they felt their musicianship paled in comparison to metal subgenres like thrash metal, traditional heavy metal, and even power metal, they would give a pass to bands like Rat, Dokken, Van Halen, Quiet Riot, Wasp, Twisted Sister, Skid Row, Scorpions, and early Def Leppard like Prehysteria. But the band that would consistently be cited as the exception to glam metal sucking, sometimes even called the only good band or the heaviest band the genre had to offer, is the band we're discussing today, Motley Crue. That's pretty much the reason I didn't think I would have to do a video for this series on them. I mean, why would I need to make one when enough people are saying,
"That's right, keep moving!"
You know what? Yeah.
Except you stay.
More than any other band in the genre, they're the one that even metal elitists will get behind. So what is making them worthy of coverage in this series? Especially since much of the general complaints about the genre they're from were touched on in the very first video I made for this series on Poison. It mostly boils down to two main things: how Crüe are perceived by outsiders, and how the last couple or so decades have seen them on a, for lack of a better term, downward spiral. There have definitely been a considerable amount of developments in the history of Motley Crue compared to if I decided to make this video 10 years ago, but I'm getting way too ahead of myself, so let's go back to the beginning. Motley Crue is yet another band I have Guitar Hero to thank for exposing me to them. I've made it known before that my favorite of all the Guitar Hero games is Guitar Hero 2, with how much bigger and more varied of a soundtrack it has, improvements in the controls and graphics, the addition of new features such as co-op mode and practice mode, and loads more improvements over the first game that made it so much more fun to play. The first song and the first tier of the setlist is Shout of the Devil. I wouldn't say I was blown away by the song my first time playing compared to other songs in the game, but what I do remember thinking was that it certainly made for a pretty eclectic opening song. The riffs and lead lines were exciting enough to have me looking forward to what else the game had to offer, and it wasn't long before it became one of the first songs from the game I bought on iTunes, along with the likes of Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses, Crazy on You by Heart, Cherry Pie by Warrant, Killin' in the Name by Rage Against the Machine, Hangar 18 by Megadeth, Freebird by Leonard Skinner, and my favorite song in the game that of course also topped my favorite instrumental songs video, YYZ by Rush. Of course, with this in mind, Crüe was also responsible for giving me my first taste of hair metal, but they weren't the band that made me fall in love with it. It's a common misconception that Motley Crue invented glam metal, but its roots trace back to the 70s. One band that's commonly cited as laying the groundwork for the image and attitude associated with the genre is the glam punk band the New York Dolls. There's no denying that without this over-the-top band, bands such as Crüe wouldn't have sported makeup and tight clothing, but the band I always saw as inventing the glam metal sound is none other than Van Halen. I'm gonna play a song from a glam band in the 80s, and then a song from Van Halen's first album. I've never understood why people refuse to credit Van Halen as the inventors of the style when this should really speak for itself. While there were plenty of hard rock bands in the 70s that dozens of bands in the glam scene would take influence from, like Kiss, Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, and Aerosmith, Van Halen was always the band I felt was the biggest influence on the sound. The scorching riffs, the juicy guitar tone, the boomy drum sound, and of course, the wild solos. No other band sounded like them at the time, and they became a band that just about every metal band in the 80s wanted to emulate. They wanted a David Lee Roth for their vocalist. They wanted an Alex Van Halen for their drummer. They wanted someone to play bass. But most of all, they wanted an Edward Van Halen playing guitar.
Wild Stallions will never be a super band until we have Eddie Van Halen on guitar.
My best guess as to why people don't like acknowledging Van Halen as the first glam metal band is because they debuted in the 70s, while glam metal is seen as more of an 80s thing. But once again, compare Van Halen's sound with a band like Goin or Winger, and you'll find enough similarities that you'll have no choice but to concede. Van Halen were the band that really got me intrigued by the glam sound, especially with their version of You Really Got Me being another song in Guitar Hero 2. I remember my first time listening to Eruption on the compilation CD my uncle included in the giant collection of compilations he burned for me, and being quite literally dumbfounded at what it was that I was hearing. But Motley Crue is the band that I see as having planted the seed for my love for the genre to grow and grow and grow over the next 2 to 3 years. They were never my favorite hair band, but it was not hard at all for me to understand why they were among the bands that were respected the most in that scene, let alone with the kinds of stories there are about them. Whenever I talk about glam in my videos, I like referencing this book, American Hair Metal by Stephen Blush, which I ironically found in Seattle of all places. Along with giving a general retrospective of the history of glam and the culture of the time, the book contains lots of photos of many of the bands, pictures of memorabilia, and even fan art and fan letters that were printed in magazines at the time, and quotes from many of the band's members to help paint a picture of what the time was like for them. A lot of focus is given to Motley Crue in this book, and I'll give some examples of it throughout this video. But one quote that always stuck out to me is this one from a guy named Corky Gunn, the vocalist of a band called Sweet Pain, that really puts into perspective how big of a deal Crüe were in the scene. I can honestly say that nobody partied harder than Motley Crue. Any story you've heard of them is probably not crazy enough. After a while, it wasn't about sex anymore for the guys because they had so much of it. It became about who could do the wildest stuff. I remember they'd get girls to do stuff like have the phone receiver up inside them as they would call their mothers. Notice how unlike the rest of the quotes in the book, this one isn't dated, which implies to me that it was recent at the time of the book's publication in 2006. That should say something about the lasting impact Crüe made. But as revered as they were by their peers, there were also negative portrayals of the band that also spoke volumes as to how on top of the world they were in the 80s. Aerosmith's comeback hit Dude Looks Like a Lady was written about an experience with Vince Neil. Iron Maiden frontman Bruce Dickinson's debut solo single, Tattooed Millionaire, is believed to have been written about Nikki Sixx. And I always had this theory that Money for Nothing by Dire Straits was written about Motley Crue as well. You know that one verse in the song that everyone brings up when claiming the song aged poorly? You know which one. Derogatory language aside, think about it. Earring in the makeup, that's his own hair? The song is about the resentment working class people feel towards musicians on MTV living the easy life, not having to perform the laborious tasks they do, but this is clearly referring to a hair band. This song came out in 1985, and what hair band was mega omnipresent at the time? Motley Crue. It wouldn't make sense for that verse to be referring to a band like Def Leppard or Quiet Riot or Rat, because Crüe was much more out there at that time. Twisted Sister I could kind of see an argument for with how freaky Dee Snider looked, but I always saw Motley Crue as being a much bigger band than them. They were a band that was hard to ignore throughout the decade, and as threatened as Crüe felt by bands like Poison and Bon Jovi rising up in the mid-80s, such as when they complained about Jovi soaking up much of the spotlight at the 1989 Moscow Music Peace Festival, they still managed to maintain their relevance and reputation as kings of the scene. Even if I would say bands like White Lion, Extreme, Dokken, Winger, and Stryper might have more talented members, you can still see the talent present in Motley Crue. Let's just say there's a reason they're the main band even people that don't like glam oftentimes get behind. Even if you've never heard their music before, you probably have a good idea of what they sound like. Vince Neil, aka Vincent Neil Wharton, has one of the most recognizable voices in the genre. Much like I've said about Dave Mustaine in my Megadeth video, there's this snarl in his voice that gives it a lot of power and character that you don't hear with many other glam vocalists. There's a hint of a rasp in his voice as well, but unlike with vocalists such as Stephen Pearcy of Rat, Blackie Lawless of Wasp, and Steve Whiteman of Kix, it doesn't come across as at all overbearing. Plus, you'd be hard-pressed to find a performance like the one Vince gives at the end of one of my favorite Crüe songs, Dancing on Glass. On the surface, it might not seem like Tommy Lee, aka Thomas Lee Bass, is as bombastic and dynamic of a drummer as the likes of Bobby Blotzer of Rat, Rod Morgenstein of Winger, Ainsley Dunbar or Tommy Aldridge when they were in Whitesnake, John Fowler of Steelheart, may God rest his soul, or even Rick Allen, the one-armed drummer of Def Leppard. But in addition to the size of the kit Tommy played, he keeps consistently good time, slams hard, and throws in creative fills. And I always like the sound he gets when he plays on the ride cymbal, but credit there should also be given to their longtime producer, Tom Werman, for bringing that sound out. But the big thing that made Tommy Lee such a standout drummer was his acrobatics.
I wanna see Tommy Lee back spinning those sticks.
There's some phenomenal drummers I can think of, but you'd be hard-pressed to name one that plays a drum solo while strapped to a drum roller coaster that spins and turns him upside down, at least at the time. When I saw Motley Crue live in 2011 when they put their differences with Poison aside and co-headlined with them, the roller coaster drum solo might not have been as crazy as I anticipated, but I nonetheless recognized the skill that goes in to do such a thing, and he even brought a kid to ride the roller coaster with him. I was certainly jealous. With Nicky Sixx, aka Frank Carlton Serafino Ferrana Jr., I always felt his bass parts were good, but my favorite thing about the role he plays in Motley Crue is that he's the primary songwriter. The other members do have their share of contributions to the music or even the lyrics, but Sixx is the one constant, which I've always believed is a crucial component to what makes Crue's songs as fun as they are. But of course I'd be remiss if I didn't share the one fact about Nicky Sixx that remains one of my favorite pieces of trivia, next to Jim Cummings finishing Scar's vocals on Be Prepared in The Lion King after Jeremy Irons' voice gave out. You see, Nicky is one of what I imagine to be a very small number of people that have died and came back to life. He's like the in-between of the two Jesuses. Crüe did a lot of drugs in their day, but hardly anyone went as hard as Nicky Sixx. On December 23, 1987, he overdosed on heroin and was declared clinically dead for about 2 minutes before the paramedic, who was a huge Motley Crue fan, revived him with a big ol' shot of adrenaline to the heart. This experience was of course the inspiration behind one of Crue's biggest and most recognizable of songs, Kickstart My Heart, because Sixx's heart was quite literally kickstarted. Another part of the American hair metal book I always found really interesting is during a chapter that focuses on the drugs and alcohol that the guys in the bands all engaged with. There's one page titled, Why Do You Think They Call It Dope?, named of course after the song by Love Hate, that shows Sixx flip-flopping on doing drugs throughout the years that really paints a picture of the kind of patterns he had. 1985.
The fans understand that the drugs, the sex, the drinking, and the excessive lifestyle are reflected in Motley Crue's music.
1986.
We just want to get laid and get wasted.
1987.
I don't do drugs. I think drugs are bad.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
1988.
We really thrive on the word sleazy. Everybody has groupies, gets drunk, does drugs. Everybody has wild sex. We are just very honest. We admit it.
Eventually.
I don't do drugs. I don't do drugs. I wish people would get that through their heads.
Drugs are bad. You shouldn't do drugs.
1989.
I was totally addicted to heroin and went through rehab.
Later.
Rehab was hell. Kicking drugs seemed impossible to do.
1990.
Kicking drugs has been as exciting as getting strung out on them used to be.
Later.
Yeah, the first rehab didn't work.
While you could argue that some of these responses came as the result of wanting to look good to the media and that there may be some denial on his end as well, I'd say the timing lines up with that near-death experience. Being pronounced dead, even if it was only for 2 minutes, was enough of a wake-up call that Sixx had to seek rehab. But as you saw, that only helped so much. Thankfully, he did go on to commit to getting clean and has been sober for 22 years as of last year. His battles with addiction are also reflected on in his more modern-sounding side project, 6am, particularly on their 2007 debut, The Heroin Diaries, which also serves as a companion piece, or soundtrack, to Sixx's autobiography that came out the same year.
You can't quit until you try. You can't live until you die.
But it goes without saying that my favorite member of the band, and the person that I view as being the main talent of the band, is Mick
Mars, dude.
aka Robert Allen Deal. While Vince, Nicky, and Tommy got much of the attention as the rowdy characters they were, Mick Mars always struck me as being the more laid-back and quiet guy in the band, which led me to view him as being the guy with the most class of the four and putting the music first. There are certainly guitarists in glam metal that I see as being more virtuosic, but along with Nicky Sixx's writing and Vince Neil's vocal inflections, Mick Mars' guitar playing is what gives Crue's songs perhaps the most character. He might not be a shredder like Vito Bratta of White Lion or Nuno Bettencourt of Extreme, but so many of his riffs and solos are so slick and even have some bluesy flair to them, which distinguishes his playing from a lot of his peers in the scene. He's the main reason why my favorite Motley Crue song is Looks That Kill. In addition to the riff in the chorus having some chromatic ascension to it, listen to how wild the solo is. By the way, doesn't that riff I played a bit ago remind you of this? He's played tons more cool solos in Crüe's songs, but none have matched Looks the Kill for me. One other thing that makes the writing and the riffs in Crüe's songs distinct from the pack is the tuning they play in. When you listen to just about any glam metal band, they're playing in one of two tunings. They're either playing in E standard with the strings tuned to E, A, D, G, B, and E, or they're playing a half step down with the strings tuned to E flat, A flat, D flat, G flat, B flat, and E flat. A big part of why E flat standard is my favorite tuning that I like having my guitars in is because so many glam metal bands like playing in that tuning, so they can play in keys like E flat, A flat, D flat, or C sharp, G flat, or F sharp, or even my favorite key, F minor, in the F sharp position on the fretboard, but Crüe tune lower. Rather than E standard or E flat standard, they play in D standard with the strings tuned to D, G, C, F, A, and D. Much like I talked about in my Korn video, this gives their songs a much darker edge and an interesting flavor that you don't really hear with many other bands in the genre. A lot of their songs are on either D minor or G minor, but they're played in the E and A positions on the fretboard. Like take Girls, Girls, Girls for example, one of the only Motley Crue songs I've taught myself to play. Here's how it would sound in E standard. Now here's how it sounds in the proper tuning, a whole step down. It does a better job giving a sense that the boys are looking for trouble to get into in their night on the town. That's something I remember feeling my first time listening to the song because I was on a bus ride home from a field trip and it was dark out. Were the songs played a whole step up, it would have sounded a lot more generic, so playing in D standard gives Crüe's songs loads more character than you realize. Speaking of which, now let's go through their albums. It's not like I can't understand where people get the idea that Motley Crue invented glam metal from, considering their debut, Too Fast for Love, came out in 1981, when the genre was just beginning to get a foothold in the mainstream. It actually didn't come out much long after the band formed the same year, when Tommy Lee recruited Nicky Sixx after seeing him with his previous band, London, a band that's best known for functioning as the starting ground for a number of musicians from the LA scene, including Blackie Lawless of Wasp, Fred Curry of Cinderella, and Izzy Stradlin of Guns N' Roses.
Yeah, well, this is like the training school for rock stars. Yeah. It seems like we get somebody in the band, and as soon as they leave, they become rock stars.
Sixx had a lot of material that was rejected by London, and when Mick Mars and Vince Neil were brought into the fold, they came out with the album that's seen as being the rawest in their discography. Too Fast for Love is pretty rough around the edges, but in the midst of that, you can tell that something big and special was brewing. My favorite track on the album would of course be the ever so pounding and driven Live Wire. But the other tracks I view as standout include Public Enemy No. 1, Take Me to the Top, Piece of Your Action, the title track,
On with the show!
and Stick to Your Guns, which maybe that band got their name from? Probably not. 1983's Shout at the Devil, however, is the album that really broke them out, and it's the album many would argue is Crüe's best. It's my second favorite, my favorite will come later, but I definitely see it as one of their most memorable albums. Kinda like what I talked about in my Blink-182 video about how albums like Dude Ranch and Take Off Your Pants and Jacket function as bridge and gap albums in the evolution of Blink's sound. A big reason why Shout at the Devil is a good candidate for Motley Crue's best album is because it functions as the bridging gap between the raw sound on Too Fast for Love and the more glossy sound on their next releases. There's still rawness present, but the execution is a lot stronger now that the band have a better idea of what their sound is going to be like, and it certainly blew things up for them and made them the household name that they were. But what also helped was Crüe becoming one of the first targets of the PMRC at this time. We all know that this is the group that prompted the Senate hearing that John Denver, Frank Zappa, and of course Dee Snider of Twisted Sister famously testified at, that resulted in the parental advisory sticker you see on a lot of albums today. And I'm sure you all are familiar with the group's Filthy 15 list that was put together after Tipper Gore, the group's founder, caught her daughter listening to Darling Nikki by Prince and getting absolutely mortified at the song's lyrics. A number of heavy metal acts of the early 80s were included on this Filthy 15 list, including Venom with Possessed, Black Sabbath with Trashed, Twisted Sister with We're Not Gonna Take It, Def Leppard with High and Dry, Merciful Fate with Into the Coven, Judas Priest with Eat Me Alive, and of course Wasp with Animal. So with Motley Crue having an album called Shout at the Devil out, it shouldn't shock you at all that this would rile the feathers of the conservative fundamentalist Christians that the 80s were chock full of. You'd think the title track would be the song they'd go after, but the song the PMRC ended up putting on their list was Bastard, because I guess it had more bad words, oh no. But as the Streisand effect teaches us, giving something like this negative attention only makes people more curious to check it out! And check it out they did. If you didn't know Motley Crue by the time they came out with Too Fast for Love, you definitely knew them now. Some of their best and most iconic songs are on this album. I already said that the title track made for a great introduction for me back in the day, and that's basically how I feel about the album as a whole. More than any other album of theirs, I would say Shout at the Devil is the best starting point for anyone getting into them. In addition to the title track and Looks That Kill, you also have the aforementioned Bastard, Red Hot, the very catchy Too Young to Fall in Love, Knock 'Em Dead Kid, 10 Seconds to Love, and Now, I said at the beginning of this video that Motley Crue is a glam metal band that even people that don't like the genre will bat for. But within that camp are the people that will only bat for Too Fast for Love and Shout at the Devil when they say that. Starting with Theater of Pain in 1985, the albums had more of a gloss to them compared to the previous two albums. I've never found it to be that much of a stretch musically, but something did feel different. The main factor I always saw as turning those people off is the fact that this is the album that features Crüe's first ever power ballad, Home Sweet Home. Power ballads have been a phenomenon in rock as far back as songs like Led Zeppelin's Stairway to Heaven and Aerosmith's Dream On, but I look at Home Sweet Home as being a song that really helped to popularize the concept in glam, even if it might not have been the first. Even if ballads aren't your thing, and even if you think Crüe's ballads aren't that great even by glam standards, it's important to recognize the emotion being conveyed in the music that helped the song to sound quite a bit more genuine than some of the ballads that would come later in the decade. It's worth mentioning that one thing that happened around this time that many speculate is factoring into why things went the way they did with this album was Vince Neil's involvement in a drunk driving accident on December 8th, 1984 that resulted in the death of his friend Nicholas Razzle Dingley, the drummer of Hanoi Rocks. He was charged with vehicular manslaughter and driving under the influence and was sentenced to 30 days in jail and 5 years probation, along with paying $2.6 million in restitution to the victims of the car crash and performing 200 hours of community service. To say the least, it was an unfortunate turn of events considering how young Razzle was and how Hanoi Rocks was just on the verge of finding success in the American market before the screeching halt took place. Some may see this as Vince getting off easy, especially considering he made parole after 15 days for good behavior, but a situation like this was bound to leave an impact on him mentally, and in the end, Theater of Pain ended up being dedicated to Razzle. Now that being said, of Crüe's initial run, Theater of Pain is my least favorite of their albums. It's never been the most memorable to me, but much like how Shout at the Devil functions as the tonal bridging gap between the rawness of Too Fast for Love and the glossiness here, Theater of Pain is an album I view as an important stepping stone towards Crüe's next two albums that I see as being leagues better. So it's hard for me to say I don't like the album, especially since it never really felt like a massive stretch from Shout at the Devil. My favorite track on this album is the fast-driven Use It or Lose It. In addition to that and Home Sweet Home, the other standout tracks on here are City Boy Blues, their cover of Smokin' in the Boys Room by Brownsville Station with this really fun lyric change. Keep Your Eye on the Money, Tonight We Need a Lover, and Fight for Your Rights, not to be confused with the similarly titled Beastie Boys song. But if Theater of Pain is the weak album, then Girls is here to pick up the pieces. For a little while, this one was my favorite of Crüe's albums, hence why it's on my shirt here. It takes the writing that made Shout at the Devil click and combines it with some of the gloss that had become part of their sound to come out with a sound that's much more defined. But more to the point, I'm honestly pretty inclined to call Girls Motley Crue's most fun album. We're in 1987 now and entering the explosion phase of the history of glam metal. Just a year prior, Poison came on the scene with Look What the Cat Dragged In, and Bon Jovi had their commercial breakthrough with Slippery When Wet. And 1987 also saw the release of Def Leppard's Hysteria and Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction. Leaving aside how I don't like considering Guns N' Roses and Bon Jovi glam metal, these four albums did so much business that every record label wanted to produce the next major arena filler in the world of hard rock and metal. And while there were bands that came on the scene in the late 80s that became successful, or at least saw moderate success, there were maybe twice or even 3 times as many that flopped. I talk about a bunch of those bands in my Best Glam Metal Bands You Never Heard Of video that wound up becoming the most viewed video on my channel, so check that out if you'd like to learn more. The point I'm getting at is that Motley Crue had to come out with something fun and memorable if they wanted to rebound after Theater of Pain and stay afloat. Especially since, like I said earlier, they had this resentment towards Poison and Bon Jovi for becoming the fresh-faced household names that they were. To be fair, Crüe weren't the only band in the scene that disliked Poison, but with Jovi, Nikki Sixx went from saying,
"How do I feel about Bon Jovi's commercial breakthrough? Great, they're friends of ours,"
to later saying,
Bon Jovi is everything corporate about rock and roll that we don't respect.
And the band even went as far as to play a show in their home state of New Jersey with instruments saying "Kill Bon Jovi," like what the fuck? And that's what I believe motivated them to make Girls Times 3 as awesome as it is. My favorite song on the album is the previously mentioned Dancing on Glass for how crazy the performance gets, but the title track is also one of the definitive glam anthems, or glamthems. It was my favorite song of theirs for a while before I dove deeper and listened to Looks That Kill and decided immediately that it was my new favorite. There's so much swagger in the riff, the chorus is super fun, the solo rips, and even if you might find the lyrics a little sexist, there's no denying how great of a time the song is. And the other tracks I find to be great on the album include Wild Side, which that band of course named themselves after, Bad Boy Boogie, All in the Name of, and the previously unreleased track Rodeo from the 2003 remaster. You might have noticed I haven't yet mentioned what my favorite album of Crüe's is, and by process of elimination, we're getting to that right now. With all the momentum of Girls, Girls, Girls working in their favor, and with 1989 being a pretty excellent time to be a glam metal band, I can't imagine this album being anything less than colossal. Yes, my favorite Motley Crue album is Dr. Feelgood. While Shout at the Devil contains my favorite song of theirs and did so much to establish Crüe's place in the mainstream, Dr. Feelgood always felt to me like the complete package. It's their biggest selling album, containing two of their absolute best-known songs, the title track and Kickstart My Heart, and it was also the peak of their sound, taking everything that was great about Girls, Girls, Girls and blowing it up further. It's hard to believe that this album came out almost a decade into Crüe's career. Equally hard to believe is that unlike the majority of their previous albums being produced by Tom Worman, Dr. Feelgood was produced by none other than Bob Rock. Yes, that Bob Rock. He may be best known today as the guy that simultaneously helped as well as stained Metallica's career, taking their albums in the direction he did in the 90s and early 2000s, but he isn't a bad producer, just not the best producer to be working with Metallica. But he can produce a pretty great hard rock record. See what I did there? He's produced the Cult's Sonic Temple, Bon Jovi's Keep the Faith, David Lee Roth's Little Ain't Enough, Kingdom Come's self-titled, Blue Murder's self-titled, Electric Boy's Funko Metal Carpet Ride, and even pop-punk albums like Simple Plan's Still Not Getting Any, The Offspring's Rise and Fall Raging Grace, and American Hi-Fi's self-titled. And did you know that he had his own band in 1992 called Rockhead that he both played guitar in and produced their one and only album? My point being, even if you don't like the albums he made with Metallica, trust me, I don't either. His touch more than paid off with Dr. Feelgood. It's for sure my favorite thing he's ever produced, with Keep the Faith being a very close second. But there's one other thing that makes this album special. As we've established before, Nikki Sixx is Crüe's primary songwriter. But if you look at the writer's credits in the track listing, you'll see a name you don't really see much for writer's credits on the other albums next to nearly all the songs. Mick Mars. I believe it's his input that gives the songs a very particular taste. On songs like Rattlesnake Shake, Sticky Sweet, the bonus track Get It For Free with its wicked slide solo, and my favorite track on the album, Slice of Your Pie, you can hear a lot more bluesy flavor in Mick's playing than ever heard on the previous albums. While Shout at the Devil is a good starting point for people new to Motley Crue, hey, that rhymes. The zest Mick brings to the writing, clashing with Sixx's approach, and the personality in Vince Neil's vocals on these songs are what really make this Motley Crue's best album in my eyes. I don't even care that there are not one, not two, but 3 ballads on the album with Without You, Don't Go Away Mad, Just Go Away, and Time for Change, which some may see as overdoing it. Dr. Feelgood really is peak Crüe to me. And the only other tracks I haven't mentioned, not counting the TNT, Terror, and Tinseltown intro track, are Same Old Situation and She Goes Down, and they're both awesome too. I also want to take some time to talk about another album that I don't think gets the recognition it deserves. The early 90s are a time that's often associated with glam metal's decline in popularity. There have been numerous instances of a new sound or musical trend whose rise to prominence served as a rejection of the previous era's sound, but none felt as catastrophic as the changing tides of 1991 to 1992. It's easy to blame Nirvana on the rise of grunge and alternative music for the musical shift going on, irrespective of how it actually helped rock to be fresh and relevant in the mainstream. I know I used to. But another factor that made this such a miserable time for these bands was the dysfunction within many of the bands themselves. You got a taste of what this was like in the Crybabies of Rock video I did on Don Dokken back in 2016, when I talked about the battle of egos between he and George Lynch, and a similar thing happened with Crüe in 1992. Hey, that rhymes. It's disputed whether Vince Neil was fired or if he quit, but no matter what, he was out of the band and replaced with John Corabi of The Scream, a band I talked about in that Glam Metal Bands You Never Heard Of video, to sing on the band's 1994 self-titled album that nobody remembers. So what did Vince do? He went solo. He had already written a song with the help of the Damn Yankees duo of Styx's Tommy Shaw and Night Ranger's Jack Blades called You're Invited But Your Friend Can't Come, which was featured in the 1992 film Encino Man. But he was also writing material for a solo album with former Ozzy Osbourne and Beggars and Thieves bassist Phil Susan. Susan would leave the band due to differences with the ace virtuoso guitarist Vince hired on, Steve Stevens, who's best known for playing with Billy Idol, and who also had a solo album out in addition to playing guitar on the Top Gun anthem. Stevens cranked out a bunch more material with Vince while the rest of the lineup got rounded up. Recruited were Dave Marshall on rhythm guitar, Robbie Crane on bass, who would go on to play with Rat and Lynch Mob, and Vicky Fox of Enough's Enough on drums. Much like I've said about Don Dawkins' solo album Up From the Ashes, Vince's album Exposed captures so much of Motley Crue's sound, it might as well be an unofficial Crüe album. And Steve Stevens' playing does so much to elevate the songs. Listen to how nuts he goes on my favorite song on the album, the opening track Look in Her Eyes. This guy played with Billy Idol. My other favorites on the album are Sister of Pain, Can't Have Your Cake, the cover of Set Me Free by Sweet, Livin' As a Luxury, and of course my very close second favorite, The Edge. Did the album do well commercially? Kinda. Didn't do bad numbers for 1993, which is impressive for a glam act at this time. I've always seen 1992 as the genre's final really big year, one thing that makes it my favorite year for music in the 90s, so it's kind of rare that an album from after that year has as good of a reputation as it does. Between this and the album Crüe made with John Corabi, Exposed is without a doubt the infinitely superior album that I highly implore you to check out if you haven't heard it. But while we're back in the 90s, I think this is as good a time as ever to segue into the portion of the video where we debunk the flag! There's my Vince Neil impression. This is going to be one of those weird what's wrong with, structurally speaking. I've pretty much addressed the most common complaints given to their 80s albums already throughout this video. And I also mentioned already that Motley Crue is one of the only glam metal bands that metal fans of different varieties can come together on appreciating. Plus, similar to what I said in my Bon Jovi video, Crüe are one of a very small number of bands from that scene that have been able to have legitimate longevity in the post-Nirvana world after the 80s were long over. On the surface, this seems like one of those videos that'll end the way my What's Wrong Withs usually do when I ask what's wrong with the band, where the implied answer is nothing. I'll still be implementing my usual brand of devil's advocacy, but we're gonna have to venture to some dark territories in this video that there may not be much of a defense I have for Crüe doing. The seed was planted in the 90s, but over the last decade or so, Motley Crue has been on a downward spiral. I know, I'm such a poser for using this gag. I'll start with the thing I'd say is the easiest to overlook. Just about every band I've done a video on in this series has that one album or string of albums that's seen as the one no one wants to acknowledge. For Metallica, it's Saint Anger and Lulu. For Green Day, it's Uno Dos and Tre and maybe Father of All. For Megadeth, it's Risk and Super Collider. For Korn, it's The Path of Totality. The worst I could say about the few albums Motley Crue put out after the 80s is that they're kind of forgettable. But none have the level of infamy of 1997's Generation Swine, or as I like calling it, Generation Swine Flu. Remember Swine Flu? God, the late 2000s sucked. This is an album that comes immediately to mind when we think of how bad of a time the 90s were for bands from the 80s. A number of glam bands tried and failed at making more grungy-sounding records to keep up with the times, but none were as memorable of failures as this album from the band that ruled the scene a decade prior. The big issue with Generation Swine is that it has no idea what it wants to be. It felt like Crüe was straining to sound modern for the time while having enough of their classic characteristics to not sound incredibly unrecognizable. Not helping was their decision that clearly came at the behest of their manager and record execs to get rid of John Corabi during the album's production and get Vince back in the band, as that seemed to be the surefire way to drum up publicity for the album. But the band's chemistry wasn't what it was, and they were each in a much different place than they were the previous decade. There are even moments where Nikki Sixx and Tommy Lee sing lead vocals, and it just adds to the weird disconnect that plagues the album's writing and production. If you want to learn more about Generation Swine and how weird of a time this was, Todd in the Shadows did a Train Records on it, and it's probably my favorite one he's done. But the only other thing I really have to say about it is that it can at least be disregarded without much pushback from anyone, and it's not like it has an overwhelming presence. When I saw Motley Crue in 2011, the only songs they played that weren't from the 80s were Primal Scream from the Decade of Decadence compilation album, and the title track from their 2008 album, Saints of Los Angeles. Fitting title for sure. On the note of Saints of Los Angeles, that's actually their most recent album. I've heard they're working on new music, but just like what the main point behind my What's Wrong With on AC/DC was, you kind of wish that wasn't the case. One reason why is Vince Neil's voice. Within the camp of people that don't like hair metal but will vouch for Crüe, and even within the camp within that camp that only like the first two albums, there are people that say, Motley Crue is good, but they'd be so much better without Vince Neil. Personally, I really don't have an issue with his voice on those albums, as it does a lot to give Crüe songs their attitude and character, and it's not like you really see these people hype up the John Corabi album, so it's hard to say what the deal really is. But I wouldn't be talking about Vince here were it not for this.
What? What did he say?
Aging is one of the scariest inevitabilities that life has to offer. I should know. And it's depressing to observe, seeing a performer degrade to a shell of their former self. It's not uncommon for bands of this era to play in lower tunings to accommodate for the singer being unable to hit the notes that they used to. Back in my Whitesnake retrospective, I mentioned that when I saw them live in 2015, in addition to playing the songs on a lower tuning, David Coverdale substituted the high notes with what sounded like metalcore screams for this exact reason. He put effort into coming up with a workaround for his aging vocal cords, whereas Vince just wasn't trying at all and mumbling his way through the performance like a late 2010s rapper. Maybe he was having an off day, or maybe he'd been drinking a bit too much before the show, or maybe he'd been singing Kickstart My Heart for so long that he felt he could just put himself on autopilot. But from what others have told me that saw Crüe live in recent times, that wasn't an isolated incident. It makes me glad I was at least able to see them in 2011 before things got worse, especially considering the messier things that have happened in recent times. Not putting on the best of live performances when you're this deep in your career is definitely a valid reason for a band to retire, but as I talked about in the AC/DC video, declining health is an even more valid reason. It's been known for quite a while that Mick Mars has been having the worst health of the four, struggling with a form of arthritis called ankylosing spondylitis, which affects the spine and pelvis. This of course had a negative effect on Mick's ability to play live, leading him to retire from touring in 2022, while stating that he has no intention to stop recording music, let alone playing guitar. However, the rest of the band wanted to continue touring, especially since the stadium tour they were doing with Def Leppard, Poison, and Joan Jett was making the kind of profits most bands could only dream of earning. So they quickly opted to replace him with former Marilyn Manson, Rob Zombie, and solo virtuoso guitarist John Five. This led Mick to speculate that the band was planning to do this for a while given his declining health, the poor treatment he was receiving from the others, particularly Nikki Sixx, and the fact that his pay was being reduced from 25% of the band's share of the earnings to 5%, all culminating in him suing the band. I guess this now turned into a Crybabies of Rock video. Let's play that intro.
So go on and cry me a river. Don't say this will haunt you forever. It never did. It never will.
It doesn't really shock me that Mick got this treatment, nor that the band would want to remove him, considering how, again, he always struck me as being the quiet one in the band, and that his health was worsening. Does this justify what they did?
No.
From everything I've read about this turn of events, it does strike me as conspiratorial on the part of the band. It's disappointing, considering what the chemistry between Mick and the others once was, especially when it came to the writing contributions he made on Dr. Feelgood. While I love John Five and was really happy to see him getting this big opportunity, much like Vince Neil's sloppy performance, I feel this is something that could have been easily avoided had Crüe committed to having their final tour be their final tour when it was originally announced in 2014. And given what I'm going to bring up next, this feeling very much remains true. Mick also stated in his lawsuit that Sixx called his playing sloppy, playing the wrong chords and even the wrong songs, to which Mick fired back with one of the most egregious things a band could be accused for outside of predatory behavior and prejudice towards another group. He claimed that they, particularly Nikki Sixx, were faking their performances on the stadium tour. I know for a fact this wasn't always the case, not just because I don't think I had much of a reason to think that's what was going on when I saw them in 2011, but also considering one of the fan letters in the American Hair Metal book from one Melissa F. from Woodbury, Connecticut, printed in Hit Parader in November of 1990, reads,
"This is for Nikki Sixx. I want you to know you are the best bass player and a great songwriter. You're also very, very sexy. Actually, you're the sexiest man in my life. I'd have all your children if you'd ask me. I went to your concert in New Haven where Tommy Lee fell. My dad was at the show too, and he said you were very professional and talented, which is great compliment from a guy who likes very prudish groups. I also admire you for kicking drugs. That's a great accomplishment."
I'd normally be skeptical about a claim like this, but there is video proof of this. Must you validate Glenn Fricker like this, Nikki?
You are not helping your cause in trying to convince people that bass players are actually intelligent.
It's a common practice in rock and metal these days to have backing tracks on tour to cover instruments or instrumental parts such as rhythm guitar or harmony guitar lines not being played on stage. Periphery, for example, has had backing tracks of all the bass parts in their songs ever since Adam Nolly Get Good stepped down from touring as an official member of the band to focus more on production projects and get good drums, and the band chose to not replace him or even hire a touring bassist. But Motley Crue come from a community, a generation even, that frowns on the mere concept of backing tracks. The most benefit of the doubt I can give is that I could understand if these backing tracks mainly existed to function as a fallback for if Nikki Sixx or Tommy Lee mess up, and the audience hears the same music regardless, but still, you'd think they'd know better. And this just further supports my idea that Crüe aren't in much of a position to be playing live at this point in their career. It sucks to say because I know this is something fans don't want to hear. AC/DC fans got really mad when I said it back in 2016, albeit more bluntly than here. But I wouldn't be saying this if I didn't care about this band and their legacy. Kiss at least had it in them to eventually follow through on their retirement after persisting to continue their final tour years after it was announced. Now I think it's Crüe's turn. Funnily enough, as I was finalizing the script, Mick Mars won a court order against his former bandmates. This doesn't mean the legal battle is over, but from the looks of it, the judge is leaning very much in favor of Mick. Not even just because he agrees with his claims of how improper Crüe were treating him and how unprofessional they were acting, but also because they were unable to hand over the proper documentation at a more reasonable time, and as a result, must pay Mick's legal fees. I'm sensing that this could be the start of a gradual upward trajectory in this case, but remember, this is only one piece of the overall puzzle that's been accounted for so far. There's still the issue of whether the band breached their contract in order to get rid of Mick, which I see as being the main crux the lawsuit hinges on. No matter the case, and even with Mick winning this court order, it's nonetheless an ugly thing to observe when you know these matters could have been handled way more amicably than they were, and it leaves this stupid glare on a legacy as big as Crüe's. But what is their legacy exactly? Surely you don't intend on ending this video on a sour note, Shades, I hear you say. Well, some people have this idea that Motley Crue can be summed up simply by watching the 2019 Netflix biopic The Dirt, with our old friend Machine Gun Kelly playing Tommy Lee, and even Anthony 10 Second Song's Vincent as John Corabi.
Hey Shades, can I talk about this?
Why?
Cause I'm a film buff and I was gonna make a Death Metal Cinemas on The Dirt when it was released on Netflix.
Atticus, you know you can just make that video for your channel on your own accord whenever you feel like it. You don't need to come on here to do it.
Dude! You're the one that's doing what's wrong with on Motley Crue, and The Dirt is an important thing to touch on when analyzing their public perception. And since I'm way more familiar with this movie than you might as well let me have this, okay?
You know what? When you put it that way, I actually have a feeling your perspective on the movie could be quite compelling for this video. Have at it, my friend.
So, hey everybody, this is Atticus the Death Mailer. I was going to make a Death Metal Cinemas on The Dirt with Shades back in the day, but life got in the way. So I'm making it up with this episode on What's Wrong With. The Dirt is based off of the autobiography of the same name made by all the band members of the Crüe, starring Douglas Booth as Six, Daniel Weber as Vince, Iwan Rion as Mick, and of course, Machine Gun Kelly as Tommy. Say what you will about MGK, but he did a good job playing as Tommy Lee. The film was directed by Jeff Tremaine. If the name sounds familiar, that is because he was the guy responsible for making Jackass and Wild Boys. But the production has a very interesting story behind it. In 2006, film adaptation rights to the book, the band along with Neil Strauss, who published it, were brought by MTV and Paramount at the time. Larry Charles was tapped to direct the film. However, production on the film stalled, and in 2008, Six spoke of his frustration in an interview stating, "We're trying to get them out of the way to make this movie that should have been made a long time ago. MTV has become bogged down in its own way. It's a channel that used to be hip and has now become unhip. We signed with them because we believe they were right, but they haven't come to the table. We need to find the right partner. They are not the right partner." In November 2013, Jeff Tremaine signed on to film The Dirt, with the film having been dropped by MTV Films and Paramount Pictures. In January 2015, Focus Features picked up rights to the film. However, production languished in development hell until March 2017, when Netflix bought worldwide rights to the film. And the rest is history, they say. When it comes to how accurate the film was, I think they nailed it on a lot of events. Their humble beginnings at the Whiskey A Go-Go, the rise of him in glory, the fatal accident and manslaughter of Hanoi Rock's drummer Razzle, Six ODing, and then being brought back to life. And of course, the infamous scene with Ozzy Osbourne, played by Tony Cavallero. Now I have a goddamn excuse to make this segment. First and foremost, I believe this was when Ozzy was, well, prime Ozzy, still coping over the death of Randy Rhoads. But I will point out one inaccuracy of the scene. Ozzy did not do a blind of walking ants. Jake Lee, Ozzy's former guitarist, stated, "I was there, and I never saw ants. I was right there, he snored a little spider. There was not a trail of fucking ants." Tommy Lee says it, Nikki Sixx says it, Ozzy says it, but they were all fucked up. I was not. I was just trying to get a fucking suntan. That's all I was doing. They were getting fucked up. Though the pissing and licking the piss off of the pool was, pretty accurate.
Everybody else has a drink.
No! No! No!
You're a god, dude.
That's all I gotta say. But the most fucked up part was what they cut off on the film. Tommy Lee states in an interview before that fiasco in the pool that he helped the Prince of Darkness to his room. But Ozzy dragged Tommy inside, claiming that he wanted to show him something. And it was this.
I'll bet you want to torture me now, don't you?
And I fucking pinned it out of there, dude. I was like, this is on some other next level shit. Like, I'm not really ready to compete at this level.
But I will say I was very impressed on how the actors portrayed the members. Iwan Rion having some knowledge playing guitars was a bonus, along with Daniel Weber being absolutely spot on, matching the vocal style of Vince Neil in his prime.
Put me in a light tonight, out on the streets again. Put me on, I'm hot to style, something you never forget.
Say what you will about MGK, but he actually did learn a thing or two with one of his touring drummers for playing the role as Tommy Lee. Douglas Booth, though, was the glue together on how he acted and played bass for Nikki Sixx. Other than that, it's your own interpretation on how you feel about the band and how they were like when they were young. The Dirt was released on March 18th on Netflix, gaining a lot of hype and popularity with Motley Crue. And I recommend watching it if you are die-hard fans of the band, or if you're interested in checking out the band yourselves.
Much like with any other biopic or piece of historical fiction, I think a movie like The Dirt is best viewed as entertainment first and less so as an accurate recounting of the history of Motley Crue. Being that I'm as versed in this band as I am as a self-appointed glam nerd, I was familiar with much of the events depicted going into this film, and there were even things the movie skipped over or got incorrect that I took notice of that I won't talk your head off with. I think Atticus did enough of that. The important thing about this movie's release was that it got people talking about Crüe. And while it was cool seeing people I knew take an interest in this band from the 80s that I'd been repping since I was a teenager, not all of the talk going on about them stemming from The Dirt was great, because the film does a lot to portray all four of the members as the decadent beasts that they were. Did the movie go a bit far with its portrayal of the band in that department? Yeah, I'd say they did. But let's not mince words here. They fucked around and found out more than any other band in the scene. Which is why I'd say The Dirt is more of a dramatization of the things that took place throughout their career in the 80s and into the 90s, and not something to use as the basis of one's judgment of what the band was really like. But the thing I found the most disappointing about the aftermath of The Dirt is that not too long after its release, we learned that Crüe were straight up told by the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that they were going to get inducted, even though they meet all the eligibility requirements. I genuinely believe that The Dirt is what influenced that decision, because the Rock Hall didn't want any bad PR from inducting a band like this that did the kinds of things depicted in the film, especially those that were based on true events. Obviously, we can point out the hypocrisies about that decision till the end of time, and rant about how much of a joke the Rock Hall is with how many great bands have gotten snubbed over the years in favor of bands that have gotten in the moment they became eligible, along with artists that hardly have any connection to rock whatsoever. But the big thing I remember thinking upon hearing about this and seeing it coincide with The Dirt's release is that Motley Crue had come full circle since the days of the PMRC. They had once again sent an uptight institution into a tizzy over their antics. It's funny, but also sad. Because if you strip away all the chicanery, you get a legitimately talented band that put out some of the most iconic albums in glam metal. You get a band that lived by the core aspects of what makes the 80s so appealing to people: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. They were Andrew WK before Andrew WK, and the embodiment of nearly everything that makes a band like Steel Panther endearing to people today. They represent the kinds of things people that perpetuate the notion that rock is dead believe the rock and metal scene is lacking. People sooner remember all of that than they do any of the past or present drama associated with the band. I always preach about the importance of separating the art from the artist, and the story of Motley Crue is a surefire example of it in action. Because no matter how deep their downward spiral has gone, or continues to go, no matter how much I think it would be in their best interest for them to quit while they're ahead, there's no denying what it was that made Crüe important, and what makes them one of the few glam metal bands people that generally don't like the genre will speak positively about. They're more or less the definitive hair band, and even if there may be bands within the genre that I personally like a lot better, they're always going to mean a lot to me. So this is normally the part at the end of the video where I ask you, the viewer, what's wrong with Motley Crue? And while this video definitely outlined a lot of what is wrong with them from the perspective of a fan, the question I'll instead end the video with will be, is there really anything else wrong with Motley Crue? Please be rational when leaving your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video, take care, and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I'll see you next time.